Welcome, my dear students of class 11 to this English class with me, your tutor, Atsinyo Sekose. Today we are going to continue with the lesson that is chapter 6, page 56, Why Can't a Woman Be More Like a Man? Written by George Bernard Shaw. And in the previous class, we have discussed the context of this lesson. We have understood a little bit about the play here and from where our lesson is picked up from. And at this point, I'm sure you are able to understand that what Professor Higgins is trying to say here is very contradictory. At the same time, the character, Professor Higgins, is the mouthpiece of Bernard Shaw, who is also trying to ridicule the stereotyped way of labeling men and women differently. So that is what we are discussing here. Now, to pick it up from where we have left in our previous class, you would have to turn to page 58, and I would read out the next few lines, and we would continue with our discussion. So we stopped from, would you be slighted if I didn't speak for hours? And now, if you take a look at it, we have a new character here by the name Colonel Pickering. You are already aware of who is Colonel Pickering and what does he has to say. In fact, he has very little to say here throughout this entire conversation. Remember that at this point of time, Professor Higgins is in a fit of temper because Eliza Doolittle has run away and he's shouting at trying to question, trying to reason, and trying to talk to Colonel Pickering and trying to make sense of women's behavior here. So when he asked, would you be slighted if I didn't speak for hours? Colonel Pickering said, of course not. Now take a look at it. He's asking this to the gender, the same gender that is male here. So what we see here is, again, a confirmation of what he believed in, that is Professor Higgins believed in, from a male perspective. So that becomes very ironic here. Now, Professor Higgins is asking this question to Colonel Pickering, and Colonel Pickering, obviously, he would not mind if Professor Higgins does not talk to him for hours. See, that kind of context that we see here. And Further, he continued asking, would you be livid, would you get very angry if I had a drink or two? And what does Colonel Pickering has to say? Nonsense. He wouldn't mind at all if Professor Higgins had a drink or two. But if it is the relationship, or if it is in the context of a male and a female, or if it is to do with mother, son, or for that matter, husband, wife, maybe the wife would mind if the person or the husband drinks a few more than 2 drinks. So that is the case here. So the context is actually very humorous in this context. Would you be wounded if I never sent you flowers? Now again, remember, take a look at it. He's talking to Colonel Pickering here, and Colonel Pickering is a male. Professor Higgins is a male, so we get to see it from the male perspective only. This is why we say that Bernard Shaw is trying to criticize the fact that we stereotyped men and women in that way, and this is what we find here. Now, Colonel Pickering would not mind at all if Professor Higgins does not send him flowers. In fact, it does not matter at all, but the fact that he's trying to confirm that from the point of view of male becomes very ridiculous here. He goes on, well, why can't a woman be like you? See, he's asking, in fact, expecting a woman to act more like a man. So if you consider this, expecting a man or a woman, for that matter, to act more like a woman, that would be ridiculous. The same case goes with women being expected to act more like a man. So that is what we have here. And what does Colonel Pickering has to say about that? Never, he said. I will never feel hurt if you do not send me flowers. And he goes on again, well, why can't a woman be like you? Now, this is a refrain, that is a repetitive thought or idea here. So that is a refrain. A refrain is a poetic device when the writer tries to repeat certain thoughts or ideas repeatedly in order to make stress or in order to put emphasis on that point. So we get to understand that George Bernard Shaw is also trying to get this point across to the readers here. Now, we will continue with the following lines. One man in a million may shout a bit. Now and then there's one with slight defects, one perhaps whose truthfulness you doubt a bit. But by and large, we are a marvelous sex. Why can't a woman take after a man? Because men are so friendly, good-natured, and kind. So we get to see here the perspective of Professor Higgins, that he expected women to act like a man, and he sees things from a single perspective. That is what we can also say here. And remember, we have discussed that he was shouting at this point of time. So here is again the irony. One man in a million may shout a bit. Out of millions of men that you would find, maybe one, you would find a little default or defects in one male sex. So that is the reason that he's trying to convey here, which is ridiculous, because he's the one that one out of that million male who is doing all the shouting at that point of time. Now and then there's one with slight defects. So he defended males in that way. Maybe out of hundreds, one may have a defect. One perhaps whose truthfulness you doubt a bit. Maybe out of that 100, maybe you would find a male who is not very truthful. So that is very stereotyped view of male, or we can also say a very prejudiced view of male. So in the previous class, we have learned that Professor Higgins is a very insensitive person. At the same time, he has a very prejudiced, prejudiced person, prejudiced mind when it comes to gender. But by and large, we are a marvelous sex. Again, talking about the superiority of the male gender. So that is his view here. He viewed men as the superior sex or the superior gender. And he goes on saying, because men are so friendly, good-natured and kind. Why is it that they are superior? They are very friendly, they are very kind, they are very truthful, they are noble, remember? So that is what he said about men, praising them to that extent. But the situation here, the irony here is very funny. Why? Because he is not that sort of a man himself. Why? Because we learned that in transacting education or learning process to in fact Eliza Doolittle, is that we find that he treated her in a very inhuman way. Remember, he called her as gutter snipe, squash cabbage, good for in fact nothing that she is not able to learn in, and so on. That she was being treated in such an inhuman way. She would go on hungry if she's not able to learn anything for a day. So that is the kind of case that we find here. And in fact, you would also find that Professor Higgins' housewife, Mrs. Pierce, also said or mentioned that the way he was treating Eliza Doolittle was not fair. And yet here is the man or the professor who is saying that men are very fair in their dealings, they are very kind and so on. They are very good-natured. And here he is preaching that women should act more like a man. So here is that irony, which is again very important. And in the following lines, a better companion you will never find. If I were hours late for dinner, would you bellow? Would you shout at me? Would you get really mad at me if I am late for dinner? But usually you would find that, again, stereotyping women or especially wives as nagging women who would go and complain if you are late for a few minutes for dinner and so on. So remember, you have to understand that Professor Higgins is a confirmed bachelor who hardly goes out into a social gathering, and he does not like the female companion. In fact, the only female companion here he has, and a very good one at that, is the mother. So his mother, in fact. So that is the case here. And yet, he's saying that men are such great companions. So that is a very single viewpoint that he has. Then what does Colonel Pickering has to say? Of course not. Men would not shout at you if you are late for dinner, in fact. Professor Higgins, if I forgot your silly birthday, would you fuss? Would you make such a big deal out of forgetting a birthday if I forget your birthday. Now remember, who is he asking that question? He's asking Colonel Pickering, who is a male. But remember, in the context of a male and a female, or a wife and a husband, or for that matter, a girl and a boy, women or men for that matter, in that kind of a scenario, I think the women would actually mind, because women can be more emotionally drawn. So what you would find is that some people might mind if you forget their birthdays. In fact, we know that some people can really make a big deal out of it, because that is the case here. But between men and men, I think if you are to say that to your friend, to a male friend, they would find you very ridiculous. So that is the case here. He's asking another male companion to confirm that. Now, Colonel Pickering said, "Nonsense. I would never mind if you forget my birthday. Professor Higgins, would you complain if I took out another fellow? If I take somebody else out for a dinner, or I went out with somebody else, would you mind?" If it is in the context of a wife and husband, I think the wife would mind a great deal. Colonel Pickering, never, but it is not so. Colonel Pickering is a male gender here, so he would not have mind at all. Professor Higgins, he continued, "Why can't a woman be like us?" Now, you would notice that these are actually not in reference to Colonel Pickering, but Mrs. Pierce. So Mrs. Pierce is the housewife of the confirmed bachelor, that is Professor Higgins. And here we find that the context here is that after this discussion, while all this conversation is going on, Colonel Pickering was actually calling up the police in order to report that Eliza Doolittle is missing, because she ran out, remember? And what happened is that finally Colonel Pickering was able to locate where she was and went out to fetch her. But here is Professor Higgins complaining everything about it, and he came downstairs and found that Colonel Pickering at that point of time had already left to fetch Eliza Doolittle, and he found Mrs. Pierce trying to serve them tea. What happened is that now he continues with his berates, we can also say, or complaints or criticism of women to Mrs. Pierce here, and said, "Why can't a woman be like us?" Asking the same question. Remember, this is a refrain here. Why can't a woman be more like a man? He goes on. He could not simply comprehend that women act and behaves in such a manner, in manners which he do not understand at all. Men are so decent. He goes on praising men, saying that they are very decent. You might want to note those things down. Such regular chaps. They are quick, normal in their dealings and fair in their dealings, ready to help you through any mishaps. So what happened here is, ready to help you through any mishaps. So that's what we have here. Men are so kind, so generous. If you find yourself in trouble, they are ready to help you in any circumstance, whereas women are not. That is the criticism that he's giving here. And he goes on saying, ready to buck you up whenever you are glum. They are always ready to cheer you up when you are feeling sad. And again, if we think about it in this context here, is he cheering up Eliza Doolittle? That is what we can also question here. Why can't a woman be a chump? Why can't men, in other words, re-emphasizing the same point, that why can't a woman be more like a man? Why can't they act in this manner, the way men act? Wise thinking, something women never do. We have discussed this in the previous class as well, that we stereotyped women into thinking that or into this understanding that women hardly think for themselves at all. They do what people told them to do, and if it is something that is difficult to understand, they would leave it to the male gender to figure it out. But this is the very thing that Bernard Shaw is trying to criticize here, and here Professor Higgins is also doing the same thing here in a very ironic manner, because he thought that Eliza Doolittle is not doing any thinking at all, that after that grand party, she should also be able to celebrate with them and make merry, whereas the case here is that Eliza Doolittle is worried, doing some thinking on her part, and she realized that she can never go back to that gutter or that common life that she led, nor can she go be or keep on pretending as though she is from the upper class, talk like use proper English and talk like an upper class lady, but at the same time she does not have the means. Now we find her caught in between. So yes, she has done some thinking on her part, and so this is the irony that we find here in this context. Now he goes on saying, and why is logic never even tried? I think you can ask that to yourself, taking into consideration Eliza Doolittle's case and Professor Higgins, and think about whether who or which character is applying logic in this situation. Straightening up their hair is all they ever do. Again, we thought that women are very superficial beings, that all they worried about is their appearance, how they look, and about their hair and so on. And if you actually think about it in that context, in that 19th century, you would find that fashion or fashionable women was actually the vogue, the fashion of the day, in fact. So maybe that is what he's also criticizing here, that it went to such an extent that everyone started to think that women only worry or are concerned about their appearance rather than important things like Professor Higgins, who is very invested in phonetics. Why don't they straighten up the mess that's inside? Why is it that they are not straightening up the mess? The mess, it can be, taking again the situation here, the confusion that they have, women can get into. We also see women as very weak people or weak gender, that they hardly think, they are only concerned about superficial things. They do not straighten up the kind of emotional turmoils that they have and so on. So that is the stereotyped, again, coming back to that theme here, stereotyped view of women, and that is being reflected in all these sayings or dialogues. Why can't a woman behave like a man? Remember, this is a repetition again. Professor Higgins expected all women to behave more like a man. But I want you to take a pause here and think about if all women acted and behaved like a man, what would be left of the world? If you think about it, I think you would find some interesting conclusions here. If I was a woman, placing himself as a woman here, who had been to a ball, been hailed as a princess by one and by all, would I start weeping like a bathtub overflowing? So that is the exaggeration that we find here. Or carry on as if my home were in a tree. Would I run off and never tell where I am going? Why can't a woman be like man? So he's very exasperated. Remember, he's confused himself with his feelings towards Eliza Doolittle. He is a confirmed bachelor, no doubt, and yet you will also find that in the actual text, you will also find that he also admitted that he had grown accustomed to the company of Eliza Doolittle. So the confusion, why is it that they are not able to clear up the mess in their head first? That is the very question that is what we have for Professor Higgins here. He is not able to understand his own feelings towards Eliza Doolittle. And yet here he is criticizing women in that manner. If I was a woman, and he said, if I were a woman, he's saying, if I were a woman, but again, from the perspective of a male gender here, being hailed as a princess, if I were being hailed as a princess, if everybody accepted me as a princess, I would never run away without saying a word. In fact, that is his point of view again. See, again, we can understand here the subtext is that women are simply supposed to be looking pretty and be praised, and that they are just inferior to the male gender and expected to behave like, in fact, to behave as expected by the male gender. So that is what we have here. He finds all these things ridiculous, and the main point that we need to take away from this lesson is that we are to understand that it is from the perspective of Professor Higgins, and that we need to make a point to understand that Bernard Shaw is also criticizing how the society look at women in a very stereotyped manner. You would also find that there is a lack of empathy in Professor Higgins' character traits. Lack of empathy here in the sense that he was not able to put himself in the shoes of Eliza Doolittle to make sense of it. And if we are to talk about gender issues here, sometimes we all need to put ourselves in different kinds of shoes in order to see from different perspectives. So on that note, we would be winding up today's class. Thank you all very much for joining me.